Guys, Pastor Adam here. I pray that this resource would bless you wherever you are. If you're local to Newaygo County here in Michigan, I pray that you would find a home here at Second Church. If you're not local, I trust that the Holy Spirit would lead you to a body of believers. Wherever you are, listening to this resource or watching this video is not a substitute for being part of a local, committed body of believers who can come around you in discipleship, study the Word together, and support you in your life and enable you to get plugged into what God is doing. We're not meant to be separate. We're meant to be together. So that's my prayer for you as you begin this journey. Make sure you've got a Bible open so that you can hear from God as you watch or as you listen.
So today, we are going to go through a sermon series all in one night. There are 3 of them. I'm calling that series Promises Kept. And I know that maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You're like, how do you do a whole series in one night? Just stick with me. It'll make sense at the end. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through together the promises of God. And here's my why, just so you sort of understand what my crazy brain did. I had started thinking, like, why do we celebrate Christmas? And before you're like, Jesus, Adam, the answer is Jesus. It's the answer that's always right in church. We celebrate Christmas and we say, oh, it's the birth of the Savior, but what does that mean? Like, yes, it means God with us, that's Emmanuel, we sing about that all the time, but like, why? Why did it have to be that way? Why is this the solution? Why is this the thing that God did? And often we start saying like really, really simple surface level statements like, well, because that's what had to happen, or because people are sinful, or because whatever. But actually, the answer is all the way back on page 1 of the Bible. So it's not like a New Testament thing. And so we're going to talk about the whole Bible. I'm going to go book by book. You're going to be here about 4, maybe 5 hours. It's going to be great. Buckle up. Just kidding. Those of you that are familiar with it, I'm a little long-winded, and so that was special for a couple of you. I love you guys. Thanks for being here. So here's my roadmap. We're going to talk about history, then we're going to talk about his story, and then we're going to talk about your story. The neat thing about the God that we serve is that he could do everything without us. Like, he's all-powerful. He doesn't need me, and he doesn't need you. But he wants us. He wants us involved. And whether or not you've ever thought about it that way, there's something really magical about somebody who doesn't need you wanting you around. If you've ever been married, that'll maybe settle with you differently. There's all those, like, stereotypes about, like, women who need men to, like, open jars and kill bugs. Like, my wife doesn't even need those. She's not afraid of bugs, and she can open jars. And so I'm just there because she loves me. And that kind of love is something that you don't typically get, which is why marriage is special, but it's even bigger when you start thinking that God needs us even less than the people closest to us, and yet he chooses to not only have us involved in his story, but use us to work things out. It's magic, I think. It makes my eyes tear up a little bit, which is why I have glasses on, so you can't see it. So we're going to start with history. What I'd like to do is sort of go through the whole Bible super quickly. So rather than have like every verse one at a time, I picked out 3, starting with Genesis 3, verse 15. If you want, you can follow along in a Bible. There's Bibles in the pews around you. If you took out your phone and Googled it, you could probably find Genesis 3:15. But essentially, Genesis 3:15 is like a weird moment. Just to kind of catch you up in what's happened in the page and a half of history that's happened so far, is that God created everything. That's page 1. He makes everything. He makes the trees, and he makes the land, and he makes the light, and he makes the water, and he makes the plant. He makes everything. And then he makes people. And there's a really beautiful dance that gets done in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's sort of a poetic, like, orchestral thing. It's beautiful if you watch. He makes something, and he says it's good, and then there's evening and morning. And then he makes something, and it's good, and there's evening and morning. And he makes something, and it's good. 6 times. It's really like, it's like watching a symphony. And actually, if you go on YouTube, I'm nerdy, and so I did it. I didn't pick a video for you to watch. But if you go on YouTube and you type symphony creation, somebody else did. And it's Beethoven, and it's gorgeous. But that's sort of what the idea is. And so as you read through Genesis 1, you're like, man, what an incredible creation that he did. And I want to pause there, because there are a lot of people who are like, he's talking about creation, so now he has to answer 7,000 questions. What about the dinosaurs? How old is the earth? Do me a favor. We're going to suspend all of that. Here's why. The Bible is not actually a history book. It's more like a love letter. And so if you've ever written or received a love letter, you don't often find nitty-gritty details. Like if I wanted to send my wife a letter, I would say, "Dearest Amber, I was thinking about you today." I wouldn't start with, "Dearest Amber, I was brushing my teeth this morning with Colgate. And as I put down my toothbrush, I turned on the warm water first and then the cold water second." Like you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't include those kinds of details, and so the Bible doesn't. And so whether you believe the earth is billions of years old or you think it's exactly 6,000, that doesn't matter. Because what's actually important in the creation story is not how it was done or when it was done. Put those away. We can argue about those later. What's important is who did it and why. And so as you read the Bible, what happens is God, that's the who, does it because he loves us. Because he loves so deeply that he created people to be part of the love that he already had. Which brings me back to he doesn't need us. He is love anyway. So then what happens? This is a spoiler alert. I'm sorry. If you haven't read it, here's what happens. Eve gets tempted. She takes a fruit. She bites the fruit. She gives some to her husband. He bites the fruit. It's awful. Now, if you're a parent and your children have ever done anything you've explicitly told them not to, you know that moment. You're like, And if you've ever been a child and you've done anything your parents told you not to, you're like, oh, it's coming. So we all sort of understand what's happening in this moment. Like maybe it's like deep and theological and scary, but really it's just a parent and his child, and they were disobedient. And God could have come in and been like, "What are you doing? I told you not to do that. You ruined everything." He could have done that. But instead he goes, "Hey, where are you at?" Hey, which is funny because he's God, he knows everything, so he knows where they were. He's offering them an opportunity to come back to him. "Hey, where are you at? I don't see you." So Adam comes out and he goes, "Oh, I was scared." And so anyway, long story short, this is part of the curse that he gives to mankind. God says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head and you will strike his heel." He will crush your head, you will strike his heel. This is a promise that God makes to mankind while he's cursing the serpent, the devil, the enemy. He says, this is what's going to happen. The woman that you tempted will produce a child, and that child, though you'll hurt him, will overcome you. And it's sort of vague, and so you could point to that and say, oh, look, that's Jesus. Or you could be like, well, that could be anybody. I mean, anybody could step on a snake by accident. But that promise comes on page 1, and depending on the size of the letters you read on, maybe page 2 of your Bible. It's the beginning of our relationship to God lots of years ago. He makes that promise to us. And then he just kind of continues to renew that promise. So as you go like halfway through your Bible, you get to Isaiah chapter 7. Isaiah, for the record, is one of the lengthier prophets. He has a lot to say. God does a lot of communicating through him, and a lot of the things that Isaiah says have something to do with the Messiah, who is going to come a while from Isaiah's time, like several thousand years. There's a gap, but Isaiah speaks with clarity about what the Messiah will do. We can look back and say, oh, that's Jesus. Isaiah says, here's what I know. Talking to believers and unbelievers, which might be very much like this room. Isaiah says, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call him Emmanuel. So Emmanuel, for the record, means God with us. That should be a clue for you that God's going to do something not like from afar. Christianity, in fact, has the only religion, the only faith structure that involves a God who gets into the mess with us. We're the only faith where God solves the problem himself. Or to put it kind of in a cliche way, there are a lot of religions that have do as their instruction. Our religion says done. It's handled. Which should be like a moment, if it hasn't been for you, just like a deep cleansing breath, I can put that down. But so, okay, you get the promise in Isaiah that echoes the promise in Genesis. The woman's going to conceive, she's going to give birth to a son. Isaiah makes it even more direct. A virgin will conceive, so she's not got a husband, she's not got a partner, she's never had relations with a man, she doesn't know a man, and then she gives birth. And that child, first of all, that makes no sense. So the Israelites were probably like, you have been drinking too much wine. So you get these promises that echo all the way through Scripture. And what ends up happening, I'm going to set this down. What ends up happening is God has to sort of double down. He gives us the promise, and then he gives us the promise again, and then he gives us a promise again. So if you look through the Bible, you get a promise to Moses, you get promises to David, you get promises to Solomon, you get promises to Noah. Lots and lots and lots of times, God makes the same promise. You are going to mess up, I'm going to fix it. I don't know if you've ever needed any better, assurance in your life. I don't know where you're at individually in your lives. I know where I'm at. I'm going to mess up. He's going to fix it. Because he loves us so much that he's not content to just kind of leave us. So you get all those promises leading through Isaiah, and then Isaiah's not the end of those promises, but things keep going, and then you end up in the New Testament in the book of John. John is like the spiritual one of the four Gospels. He's the one who spends the most time talking about Christ as God. And so the very first couple of verses of John sound like this. It says, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So two things to sort of point out. Number one, Jesus was there in the beginning. So there wasn't like a time where there wasn't a Jesus. What that means for us is that while God was creating, there was Jesus. God spoke, and things happened. God said, "Let there be light," there was light. Well, how do you speak? You use words. Christ is the Word made flesh. And so that connection is important because what that means is when we fell short in the garden, Christ was there. When we started falling short and building all kinds of ridiculous towers, Christ was there. When the flood happened and washed away nearly everybody, Christ was there. When David made the mistakes Christ was there. He's been there the whole time. Or to personalize that, when you lost the job that you needed to pay for Christmas presents, Christ was there. When you had difficulties in your marriage, Christ was there. When your children didn't listen to you any longer and you didn't know what you were going to do or if they were even going to be home when you got home from work, Christ was there. That matters because we serve a God who is with us. That's what Emmanuel means. So that's the first thing. The second thing is sort of towards the bottom of that text that's on the screen there. It says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So what does that mean? I don't know if you've ever walked into a room that's really dark, that you can't quite tell how big the room is when it's dark. You can't quite tell what's in front of you when it's dark. You can't quite tell if there's like a Lego landmine you're going to step on and ruin your day. You can tell I have children. You don't know because the darkness makes everything wishy-washy. The darkness makes everything scary a little bit. That's why children sometimes they come into the world afraid of the dark because there's something about us as people that recognizes, almost at a caveman level, if you will, darkness bad. We just get it. It's not good. But then Christ comes, and just like when you enter into a room, you don't have to flip on a switch at every area of the room. Just a light switch, and the whole room changes. The whole room changes. I'm going to get weird and scientific on you for a minute, but I just want to share this, and then we're going to sing together. Did you know that darkness is imaginary? It's not real. Getting some funny faces from you guys. Here's what I mean. If you said to a scientist, "How do you measure darkness?" Do you know what they tell you? You can't. You measure the absence of light. And the reason that's important is when we say the darkness cannot overcome it, what we mean is not that the light is sort of stronger or that the darkness will get some good punches in. It's not like a bad Marvel movie. The light will conquer completely and totally and without exception. Darkness has no game. It has no opportunity to win. It has nothing. It's there only to distract you from the light. And if Jesus is your light, then you step into that in a way that cannot be overcome. That light is a gift to you, and that's what we celebrate on Christmas. So if you're interested, if you've got friends that might need to hear the gospel story in a small and maybe familiar tone, we've got copies of that story on the welcome desk. You can grab it on your way out. Let's continue. Sermon number 2. We're having a marathon today. So we've talked about history. We've talked about sort of how the promises of God have come to be. We've talked about angels declaring the glory of God in Isaiah and all these different things that have happened in the history of people. But what's interesting, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, is history is us and God chooses to allow us to be part of that history by working in us and working through us. So it's not just that God exists and we're supposed to love him, and it's not just that there's like an instruction manual or a list of rules or whatever. Those are things that like maybe you've heard, or that maybe somewhere along the way somebody mentioned to you, there's like a list of rules, and to be a Christian you have to do those things. That's actually not what the Bible is about. The Bible is the story of God and his people. And so his story, in some ways, is our story also. And there's another way that we can sort of word his story. We call it the gospel. So if you've ever heard anybody say, oh, that's the gospel, that's sort of what we're talking about. We're talking about, there's a lot of feedback. We're talking about how God works in our lives, how God messes with things is not what we're talking about. So if you ever had anybody say to you, oh, God just kind of meddles, or God doesn't answer prayer, there's a lot of like weird negatives that sort of permeate our culture about who he is. And so I want to sort of break down for you what the gospel is. And I've sort of done it in a way that hopefully is easy for you to recognize. I've done it in a way that has 5 C's. Can you do me a favor? Can you put the laptop up on the counter there? It doesn't seem like the clicker's working. Thank you. It's good times. Everything seems to go down on Christmas because if everything was perfect, we wouldn't need Jesus. Look at that, a sermon example. Anyway, so 5 C's, that's how we're going to sort of talk about creation. And that'll hopefully help you to remember it. Now, if your church doesn't teach it this way, or you've never heard it this way, I'm not suggesting this is the only way to think about it. I just think this is an easy way, especially for the youngest in the room, to sort of figure out what's going on. So, okay, C number 1, creation. We talked about that at the beginning. God made everything, and he made it what? Good. Everything was good. And then, we sort of messed things up. But the reason that it's important that you recognize that everything was good once is that it wasn't always this way. Like, when you have, like, the absolute worst day, you can remember it wasn't always like this. There doesn't have to be pain. There doesn't have to be suffering or sadness or loss. It doesn't have to be that way. And so it's important to start with creation, because then you sort of grasp this idea that there will be, because there was, a time where God eliminates that. So, okay, creation. Well, then what happens? We corrupted things. And so with that bite of the fruit, we changed everything. That's when sin enters into humanity and our bodies fundamentally change. We, at the beginning, had an understanding of who we are and who God was, and we still sort of have that, but it gets kind of muddied, it gets kind of blurry. And we have this natural tendency now to sort of hide ourselves, to be sort of ashamed of things. And I'm not suggesting that we live an entire life of shame. I just think that that's maybe like an underline to a lot of the actions that happen. That corruption affects everything that we do. And I know that often we'll hear like really big, crazy examples when we talk about things like the 10 Commandments. One of them is like, do not murder. So you could be like, well, I don't do that. I mean, unless you do, but I don't do that. And that's good. Jesus says, if you've ever been angry at a person, that's murder in your heart. Well, shoot, I get angry. Or like, don't commit adultery. Okay, happily married, check. Jesus says, if you've ever looked at a woman lustfully, adultery. Well, shoot, I've been in college. So the problem is, if everything's corrupted, even our thoughts, then there's no way in which we can actually overcome all the things we have to overcome, because the reality is God also says you have to follow these things. The righteousness that I require of you is required. It's a non-starter. Do that or not. And if the answer is not, we have a problem. But if each and every one of us is corrupt, then there's nothing we can do, and so there has to be some kind of solution outside of us. Well, fortunately, God says, well, I love you too much to sort of let that be the case. And so you go from creation to corruption to crucifixion, which is what it's called when we have a man hung on a cross for us. And so Jesus, who is God, and that's what we celebrate on Christmas, Jesus comes and he becomes a person. He was there at the beginning, not as a person, but the plan was Jesus is a person. He comes, and he lives the life that we're supposed to live. He follows the law perfectly. He's obedient to God in everything. And then we killed him for it. And that shouldn't be something that we're just like, oh, Jesus died on the cross for me. Like, I have a necklace, and I remember that. It's not simple like that. That's like a horrific, awful experience that he alone in history does not deserve. Every once in a while, somebody comes in and they say something to me like, how can God make bad things happen to good people? And that's like a big question to unpack. The really easy answer is, well, he doesn't, except for one time. And he did that willingly. He did it for us, but then what's interesting is he doesn't just kind of leave us there. So he dies on the cross, he takes away the sins of the world, and then there's like a call to arms, if you will. There's something else that happens afterwards. So after the crucifixion is something I call construction, which maybe sounds a little odd. Go with me. What do you do when you construct things? You build, you are building, you're designing new things. So construction is what God calls us to do afterwards, while he does it in us. So while he's building in us a new personality, a new spirit, a new life, what he asks us to do is go and build his kingdom, which sounds way more complicated than it actually is. What does it mean to build God's kingdom? Well, if you've ever met anybody and you said hi in a nice way, even though it's clear that they were in a bad mood, that's building God's kingdom. If you've ever put your arm around somebody who's clearly like upset and you're just comforting them, that's building God's kingdom. All Christ commands of us is to love God and love people. It's really that simple. So if you love people, that is a building of his kingdom. And I said there were 5 C's. The 5th one is completion. Well, what does it look like to be complete? Actually, what's interesting is I just didn't want to repeat the same word. Completion actually is the same as creation. Eventually, what we're building towards is a time where God will eliminate everything else. Sin goes away. Pain goes away. Sadness goes away. The difficulties of your life, the burdens that you carry, they all get taken care of in the end. Every single one of them, it just goes away. Why is that important? Well, I don't know if you've ever had a really bad day where you're just like, I just can't do this anymore. But I feel like that's like the rally cry of humanity is like, I just can't. I just can't. And Jesus says, hey, I got you. And we look forward, even on our worst days, to the day where the I got you that he promises us happens. Because if there's anything I think we've seen so far, it's that God keeps his promises. All right, we've made it. Sermon 3. See, a whole series in one night. It can be done. So we've talked about history, all the ways in which God has been promising us things and how we sort of participate in those things in some big ways and some small ways. And we've talked about his story, the gospel, and the way that sort of works itself out in life. And now we come to a really interesting part where suddenly the spotlight shifts a little bit. We're going to talk about your story. We're going to talk about my story just for a minute. I think that's important. I know that we get sort of wrapped up in the idea that Jesus is the reason for the season, which is like, an awesome bumper sticker. And it's true. But Jesus came for a reason. And we could sort of big picture that reason and say, oh, he came to save the world. That's cool. But I think it might be more helpful if we made it more specific, because he is a God of details. He came to save the world. You live in the world. He came to save you. And he came to save you. He came to save me. This is the biggest thing that you could possibly know and understand about God. So like if you're sort of not a every week church attender, if you don't even know, you just thought this church looks neat and we're going to stop in for a minute. I heard they have hot cocoa at the end, which we do. Stay afterwards. For whatever reason, God has you here. There's a reason, and he knows it, and he brought you here to hear these things. He's working specifically in your life. And so before you're like, oh, I don't know him like that, you do, because otherwise you wouldn't be wondering. the neat thing about our faith is God doesn't wait for us to make the first move. And that's what we're going to talk about here for the next couple of minutes. So when I say your story, what I really mean is there's this like burning question that I want to sort of address by way of sort of an illustration. What do you say when you die? I mean, theoretically, you're dead. You say nothing. But like, let's just kind of go on a journey. So we don't really know what happens in the afterlife. We know there's a judgment. We don't know quite who we're sitting in front of. We know God is present. We know Christ is in the judgment seat. But we don't know a lot about like what it's going to look like. So I'm going to paint a picture. I need you to sort of suspend a couple of beliefs for me for a minute. Number one, I need you to suspend the idea that what I'm about to say is in the Bible. It's not. It's a caricature. So like before you're like, Pastor Adam said, you're going to meet a bunch of people. I don't know that for sure. It's just a helpful illustration. And then number two, I don't know where each and every person lands in this room because a lot of you are strangers to me. So today we're friends and we're family, but I don't know what you believe necessarily about the end. And so what I want to do is I want to sort of walk down this idea of what might happen by telling you a little bit about a guy named Blaise Pascal. I don't know if you guys know who that is. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician, which was a word I was worried I wouldn't say correctly into a microphone, but I did. Hooray. Mathematician. And he came up with this really weird formula. I get a little squirrely. He had this formula, and that formula was for the logical reasons for or against believing in God. And so if you're interested, Blaise Pascal, they call it Pascal's wager. That's not what this sermon is about. And so I'm just going to really quickly just top line it for you because it matters for the request that I've made for you to suspend the end. So if you're like, I don't believe in that maybe there's reincarnation, or I'm an atheist and I don't believe there's anything at the end, just like suspend all of that for a minute. Here's what Blaise Pascal said about that idea. He said, if I don't believe in God and I'm right, nothing happens. It's a black void. I cease to exist. If I don't believe in God and I'm wrong, I face judgment. That's awful. So there's two options, and there's two more. If I do believe in God and I'm wrong, there's nothing. There's a void. It's emptiness. It doesn't matter. But I lived a morally upright life. I was really nice to people. People were nice to me. I went to a church. There were a lot of people there that were friendly. I had great friends. I had great neighbors. Life was good. And then the last option, I believe in God and I'm right. Eternity, perfection. It's awesome. So those are the four options, right? And so Blaise Pascal sort of figured, well, I don't know. If those are the options, I feel like there's only one that has a positive outcome. And so he gave his life to Jesus after figuring that math equation out. So I'm not asking you to like make that decision now, though now would be a great opportunity to do that if your heart is moving in that direction. Perhaps tonight's the night that you accept Jesus as your Lord. And that might be true, but wherever you're at in this moment, suspend whatever you think is going to happen at the end and play around with me for just a minute. So you die. Everyone's sad. Except you, because you're in heaven. And you come before the judgment seat, and let's just say there's like a gatekeeper who's going to let you in. And just for the sake of it, let's just say it's Peter. He's one of the main players in the gospel. So let's say Peter meets you there, and he says, hey, what you doing here? What do you say? I have a hunch, because I'm a person, and I've met people, that you will begin with, I'm here because. Right? Did anybody in their head think of anything other than I'm here because? Maybe you like worded it a little differently. But I think that likely what most of us will do is we'll lead with something. So if you're not a believer in Jesus, you might lead with, well, I gave a lot of money to charity, or like I went and I helped a lot of people, or I adopted a bunch of children, or like you might start listing all the good things you did if you're not a believer. If you are a believer, you might lead with, well, because I accepted Jesus in my heart, I'm supposed to get in. I get that's I have a ticket. I get in, right? Did I cover? I basically? Okay. So everybody says something like, because I would suggest that's wrong. It's wrong. Your answer should not be in the first person. It should not be because I. Here's why. We talked earlier about our insufficiency as people, our inability to accomplish the things that are expected of us. Well, if we're insufficient, if we can't accomplish the things that are expected of us, then how can we possibly rest on our accomplishments? And I want to push that a step farther because a couple of you are thinking, well, you mentioned Jesus. So like, oh, because I know Jesus. But I want to push a little further than that because I don't think that that's fair. Because Christ came in and chose you while you were still sinning. So then you get to the gate and you take credit? And so I want to walk through that idea with you a little differently using a story from the Gospels. There's a story about the Calvary, which is the hill that Christ was crucified on, and maybe you're familiar with it and maybe you're not. I'm going to sort of summarize for you. On that hill, Christ was crucified next to two other people. And so let's just say, for the sake of argument, Christ is in the center, there's a guy on the left and a guy on the right. All three of them are condemned to death. They're all hanging there. They've all got nails in their hands and nails in their feet. They're all nude, they're all bloody, and they're all dying. The guy to the right of Jesus is hurling insults at him. Like horrible things. Like whatever you can imagine in your head is like the worst thing anyone's ever called you, that. You're not really the Messiah, prove it, all the things, right? Jesus has no response. Like he knows what he's doing, he's dying for the people, no response. The guy on the other cross, which just so that we don't lose this point, we refer to him as the thief on the cross. So like he stole something, but stealing is not a punishable by death crime, which means even though we refer to him as the thief on the cross, whatever he stole was large enough to get him crucified. Not prison, not a fine, like he's dying. So like really big deal, huge deal. And he comes to Christ's defense. And then he says to Jesus something to the effect of, I believe. And Jesus says, today, not, hey man, I got some cool news for you. Read this book. He says, today, you will be with me in paradise. You'll be with me in heaven. Now, you could sort of brush past that story, but the reason I started that illustration with we're going to go meet Peter is because of this moment. So, okay, you're in that line, but let's say you haven't met Peter yet. You just see him. You're like a few people back in the queue. And let's say just ahead of you is that guy, thief on the cross guy. He walks up there. Peter says, what are you doing here? He says, I don't know. And Peter says, well, are you familiar with the doctrine of justification by faith? I have no idea what that is. Well, okay, let's back up. Where in Scripture do you find information about being saved? How did you learn about your salvation? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, okay, where did you go to school? I didn't go to school. Where did you go to church? What's church? Well, what denomination were you part of? I don't know what that word means. Well, what's your favorite Bible verse? What's a Bible? So, like we, in 2023, get really wrapped up, and whether you're a Christian or not, I'm certain that this is a thought that's crossed your mind. Am I enough? And if you're not, maybe you're thinking, here are all these things that make it so that I'm unqualified to accept Christ. I'm unqualified for him to love me. I've done too many things. I've hurt too many people. I'm not a good person. Or maybe you lived your whole life and you're like, I'm a good person, I don't need him, but then there's like that weird doubt in your mind. Or maybe you are a Christian and you're like, I don't know, I think I'm saved. Here's what I want you to hear at the end of this story. So this thief on the cross has no answer to any questions. I imagine at this point, Peter's like, I need to get my supervisor. I don't know what's going on here. So Peter walks away and he comes back with, I don't know who Peter's supervisor would be, John, I don't know. So John, the disciple, comes in. He's the one Jesus loved. I don't know, maybe he's the supervisor. And John says, okay, what are you here for? I don't know. I told the other guy I have no idea. Okay, the most important question then. What makes you think you should get into heaven? Like, why? And I need you to hear this with like open ears because this might be the most important thing you ever hear. The thief on the cross responds, because the guy in the middle said I could come. He has no Christian education. He doesn't own a Bible. He doesn't have a list of good works that he performed. He didn't get catechized or baptized or take communion. He didn't love his neighbor as himself. He believed in Jesus. And it's that invitation that is open to every single person. And so whether you've been a Christian your entire life and you're like, man, I just don't know if I've done, it doesn't matter what you've done. You don't have to have done enough. There isn't enough. You'll never do enough. Maybe you've been a Christian 5 minutes and you're like, maybe I got saved too late in life and I just don't know. Or maybe you're not a Christian and you're like, I don't know, it doesn't, I'm just really crappy. Like, only we know the depth of who we are as people. And that's actually only half true. Like, I know how bad I am, and Jesus knows how bad I am. And that's it, just the two of us. And what's neat is, where I might be doubting myself, or you might be doubting yourself, Jesus hung on a cross, knowing every single one of those things. Every single moment you had that pushes you and your brain away from having a God who loves you, he died for that. Every single one of those moments, the man on the middle cross said you could come. And so, I want to sort of land the plane with this question: do you know him? That might be the most important question you ever get asked. And if the answer is yes, hallelujah, we're celebrating Christmas. And if the answer is no, maybe today is the day. Maybe this is the moment where you're like, I don't want to be the guy on the right. I want to be the guy on the left on those three crosses. Maybe you're really tired of carrying all of the burdens that you carry in your life. Maybe you're like just exhausted of trying to do it on your own. It's exhausting. And if you don't know me, like I don't want to be up on this platform and you think like, oh, he's got his whole life together. Like I met Jesus at 31. So like most of my life I spent like making fun of God and living my own life and doing my own thing. And just like being on the other side of it, I just want to tell you, it's so much better. So if you don't know him, let's talk. After the service, I'm going to stay right here. And if you want to have a conversation about what it looks like to love Jesus or just to like get to know him a little bit. I mean, some people are a little slow to love, but just to like be friends with the guy. Let's talk about that. Because it's this question, do you know him, is the most important question you will ever have to answer. And make no mistake, whether you believe my little fictional story or not, at some point you will face judgment. And my heart for all of you, every single person in this room, and I know we're live streaming, hopefully it's working, there's been a lot of errors tonight. My hope for everyone who ever hears this message is when that question gets asked of you, do you know him? Your answer is yes.